in this talk, I'm going to focus on something slightly different. I'm going to look at first the modeling side of things, and then we'll present some of the data analysis, large-scale data analysis we have done as part of the study, and finally end up with presenting some of the challenges and the questions we need to ask dealing with large data in these kind of problems. So today I'll be talking about a bunch of problems related to understanding opinion dynamics in online social networks. Okay, and this is a joint work with my colleagues at MSR. So social networks are increasingly playing a central role in how we adopt or form, get influenced by, or even diffuse or propagate opinions amongst ourselves in the connected world. Okay? And why is understanding these dynamics important? Because we need to understand how a topic propagates and what kind of eventual, if you will, a fixed point or a stationary behavior arises from the diffusion and adoption of topics of various importance to all of us, right? Is there a consensus, or is there a polarization on a certain topic, etc. And this is, again, needless to say, a very important role in very large-scale applications like viral marketing and information diffusion, finding influencers in networks, and so on, right? But I look at this problem now classified into three key components, right? And again, this is not new to most of you. The three key players in understanding these kind of problems are the user in the network, and the network itself, and the message, the topic itself, the contents of the message, and so on. And what I'll do in this work is, instead of going deep into one of these areas, I'm going to present three nuggets or three different problems that we have looked at, wherein each problem focuses the central aspect of each of these components. Okay? So, and this is how I'm going to present the rest of the talk. In the first problem, we basically focused on the user, the attributes of the user. Like, for example, the propensity of the user to conform to opinions he or she sees around the network. Okay? And what kind of effect this user behavior has on the eventual propagation of the dynamic of the opinion itself in the network. Okay? And this can be largely seen as a receiver-centric problem, where the receiver is the user who is seeing opinions from around her or him, and then the user decides to take the opinion and not take the opinion. Okay? In the second problem, we actually focus on the network itself. Okay? And this one, we will highlight the importance of a network using another application of what we call wisdom of the crowd, and I'll explain more in detail as we go on, and how the network actually plays in fundamentally shifting this problem of the wisdom of the crowd in the presence of the network. Okay? And finally, we'll show how the message itself plays a very important role in addition to the user and the network, like the content of the message, right? And we study this problem in the context of another interesting problem of persuasion. Okay, and this is largely, again, can be seen as a sender-centric problem, where the sender has to pick the appropriate message to make sure that the message is adopted by as many people in the network as possible. Okay? And this will show, by including the content itself, is fundamentally different from the traditional influence maximization problems that we have seen earlier in literature. So what's the role of the user? So the central question when it comes to user in these kind of problems is, how do users adopt and update their opinions as they see their neighbors or the opinions in the network? Okay? And before we go into the understanding the dynamics itself, there are two widely studied forms of influence that we have seen in literature, that are available in literature. One is what is called the normative influence, where the users are influenced by opinions of neighbors due to some biases, social norms. This is the right thing to do, that's the wrong thing to do. Or this is the right thing to say, even though I believe something else. And versus the informational, where the users have no prior knowledge or opinion on a particular subject, and they're actually looking to the network to help them understand that subject. Okay? And what we're going to look here, or look into more detail here, is the second aspect of it. That is the informational influence. And again, there's a lot of literature in this area, beginning with the celebrated work of de Groot in 1974, where he proposed a very simple model in which the user simply averages the opinion or the values on a particular opinion from all the neighbors around the user. Okay? And then Friedkin and Johnson in 1990 have extended this model to include this very interesting and actually very important attribute of the user, which is the stubbornness or the propensity to conform, which is actually what you call encapsulated in this alpha parameter here, right? So if the alpha is 1, then the user is extremely stubborn. If the alpha is 0, the user is very conforming. So the propensity to conform is very high for that user. And the user always goes to the neighborhood to get to form his or her opinion, okay? And then beyond this, there is this other class of problems or models called the voter models, in which the user simply goes to the neighborhood and picks one of the random answers in the, from the neighborhood and then adopts that answer as his or her answer, okay? And to conform and to basically study all these models, Solomon Asch, a psychologist, has done a very celebrated, a very important and highly quoted, highly cited work in 1955, in which he basically conducted a small-scale psychology experiment with 10 people in a room, with 9 of the people participating in the experiment actually stooges. He basically planted them in the experiment and they had one subject. And then he observed how the subject actually took the answers of the stooges in the experiment for different questions, okay? But again, mind you, this is the question that was tried to answer. This experiment was run in a very close setting with 10 people and extremely controlled. Now the question we are asking is, how do you scale this to a larger online setting like in the current day social networks, okay? So can we actually see if any of these models do carry over to the way we adopt information in these large networks, okay? So before we went into large-scale analysis of data from social networks like Twitter and Facebook, we actually did reasonably, let's say medium scale with hundreds of users, online user studies with hundreds of users. And we did some very simple, like the informative side of things, surveys like estimating the dots in an image, right? Or, for example, can you estimate the number of Coke cans or Hyundai cars that are sold during the FIFA World Cup? So where it's largely informational and there is no a priori bias or what have you on these kind of questions, okay? So what we asked then, the users were asked these questions initially, and then they were presented the answers of some other participants in the experiment, and then they were asked the question again, okay? So you could treat the first answer of the user as the innate opinion, and then what the answers we present from other users as the network effect, if you will, and then the final answer is what kind of shift in the opinion or what kind of effect the neighbors had on the opinion of the user, okay? So, and this is how the experiment was set up. So the user is on the right here, and then we basically demarcated based on the response of the final answer and the initial answer, based on the differences in this answer, which is denoted by this variable s. We basically classified the user into 3 buckets. Either user is either stubborn, where the user did not deviate very much from the initial answer, S sub I, or we call the user a degrowth user, where the user basically takes some answer between his or her initial opinion, initial answer, and the answer of the nearest neighbor in the neighborhood, okay? The person who got the answer closest to the user's answer itself, versus the user went into the crowd and then pick some random answer, pick some answer from the crowd, okay? So the leftmost is the voter user, the user who is following a voter model in his or her mind. Then the one in the middle is the degrowth user, and then the stubborn user, okay? Now the question is, what kind of a user we are seeing in these networks, okay? And by the way, the data for this experiment, for the analysis actually is available on our website, and I'll be more than happy to share it. I've given the URL here, but I can give more information offline. So we did find, for example, that the user does not always predict a voter behavior or predict a degrowth behavior or is always stubborn, okay? First of all, it's dependent on the topic, but largely you can see the distribution now for these 2 kinds of experiments. One is in the dots question and the other is the car sales question, that the users do have a significant mass on all kinds of models, okay, in suggesting that they use some kind of combination or one of them depending on the topic, okay? In fact, it's more prevalent, it's more pronounced here if you see the figure on the right, that as it's just not the topic, it's also the number of users we presented, number of other neighboring answers we presented to the user. So if you presented, say, 20 neighbors, the user overwhelmingly chose the voter model because there's a lot of opinions now to choose from. And the user did not find it noisy, actually. The user did go to the neighborhood. But as we reduce the neighborhood to 1, the user almost always became a degroote, that he picked an average somewhere between his opinion and the neighbor's opinion, the only neighbor's opinion, okay? Some kind of an averaging effect. Okay? Whereas the other side, the flip side is you would go from degroote is very small. You don't tend to average, take 20 numbers and take an average of it and then take that average as your response. But so that's obvious in the 20 user case when the degroote is very small, and it keeps increasing as we go from 20 to 1 user. Okay, so what does this tell us? It tells us that neither of these models, or not one of them, actually completely explains how we adopt information. Okay, so we need some kind of a combination, if you will, of these models, right? So, and this is an attempt to basically try to come up with a simple model that precisely tries to explain this behavior, right? And what happens here, it's a very simple model with 2 parameters. One is a likelihood, the bias with which you would like to go out and pick an opinion and adopt that opinion, and the other is what is the likelihood you're going to stick to your opinion that you have, okay? So that is the bias parameter P and the stubbornness parameter alpha. So with P, what you do, you go and look for an answer outside and pick the nearest neighbor's opinion, okay, the value you see closest to yours. And then you don't, then you keep trying this till you go through all the neighbors in your neighborhood, right? And if, at the end of this process, if you didn't pick your answer, with alpha you pick your, now you go back to your classic Friedkin-Johnson, with alpha you pick your answer, and with 1 minus alpha you pick an average, right, between you and the nearest neighbor. And basically, I mean, again, we didn't get to do a lot of analysis on this, but what we can say here is at equilibrium, there is a distribution, basically the distribution of values that people do pick, of the opinions that people do choose is stable, right? That does it. So basically, like the buckets in which the degroote, the stubborn, and the voter, that distribution is fixed at equilibrium. It's not your individual opinion, that could be changing. But the mass in each of these buckets is constant, is unchanged. Okay? And in fact, the second point is even more interesting, that when the alpha is, of course, and the p's are less than 1, they're not exactly stubborn or completely biased, you do go to a consensus, and this is often what we observed in many of the real networks too. But what is interesting is this could potentially take a very long time. So what happens actually you see in real life is it's not like it's completely polarized or there's a complete consensus, but we are in the middle somewhere switching between states. But if you let this process run for a very long time, it does go to a consensus. That's what this model is predicting. And we do show some experimental support for this kind of model, where we know that unlike a voter model where we are going and picking an opinion randomly from one of the neighbors, we actually are biased towards values that are closer to us in some sense, or some kind of a majority or a mode or a median kind of bias here. So you see a large value that's being repeated often in the as an answer in the neighborhood, you tend to pick that. And that is, it flies slightly against the basic assumption of the voter model, right? And similarly, the stubborn users, in fact, they are stubborn across topics. So people who are opinionated tend to generally be opinionated across different questions, of course, in the same kind of topic. It cannot be 2 completely different topics. But this suggests that there is some credence to using some kind of combination between stubbornness, if you will, and the voter on the other side. So, and I'll talk about some large-scale data analysis later on as I conclude the talk. I'm not going to talk about it now in this part of the talk. So coming to network now, here I'm going to switch tacks, going slightly from the modeling side, pure model side of things. I'm going to look at a well-known problem, a well-studied problem, and something that we are more familiar with these days, what's called the wisdom of the crowd. And the basic point here is we have seen wisdom of the crowd being used in many, many contexts, and it's only gaining more and more importance given the large large the scale of these online networks or online settings in which we are going to collect this information today, right? So like Amazon Mechanical Turk is one good example, right? And this is only becoming more important in the advent of these MOOCs, massive online courses, and so on. And of course, there are mushrooming of all these crowdsourcing platforms today, right? But what is fundamentally different from the traditional wisdom of the crowd applications and this setting that we're talking about is the network, right? Because if you look at the traditional wisdom of the crowd experiment or a setting, most of the crowd is ad hoc. They don't interact, right? They're siloed, and that's where the usefulness of an experiment dealing with the wisdom of the crowd actually makes sense when you're trying to harness the opinion or some information that you want to get from the crowd, which is the true underlying distribution they have on a particular subject or a particular question that you have, right? But what happens in the presence of the network is this opinion gets biased, if you will, right? Because there are people who are opinionated, there are people who are stubborn, there are people who are conforming, and so on and so forth. And this can potentially change the value that you're seeking from the crowd, okay? And again, we basically, and here is a very a good work by Lawrence in 2011, where he shows that the social interactions do undermine the wisdom of the crowd, and you tend to get a different answer than you should have if you want to do an unbiased experiment, right? And again, we did a very similar experiment here, a setting here like the previous problem, where we asked the crowd based on, okay, let me just explain the experiment in a bit, but what's the goal here, right? The goal becomes now to basically debias the bias that the network is introducing in the social interactions, okay? So I would still like to do the same kind of wisdom of the crowd experiment, but this time I want to do it in such a way that any answer that a person in the crowd gives me is appropriately debiased based on some of the attributes of the user, like the propensity to conform, the neighbors he or she is connected with, and so on, right? And of course, we cannot do this kind of a study. Of course, if I knew the entire crowd and all the alphas, then I can do this exactly, right? But we cannot do this because of the size of the network and of course the interactions that I don't know the graph, etc. Right? So these are all known problems. So what is one way to approach this is we can do sampling to poll a few nodes in the network and take the answers that those few nodes have given us, then appropriately debias those answers, and then aggregate the answers the way we want, and we have our answer. Okay? So, but how do you do this? So the two key components to this, or two key questions, sub-questions in this problem, are selection of these nodes. Okay? And then once you select the nodes, how do you debias the answers given by these nodes? Okay? So, and that's the question that we're trying to address here. So again, we cannot use, so here, remember, when I say there's a network here, I'm assuming there's some kind of an opinion formation dynamic here that's going on, in which opinions are being exchanged, formed, or evolved over time. Okay? And the simplest dynamic that we can consider, which is the Friedkin-Johnson dynamic, that is slightly different from the dynamic we presented earlier, but it forms an important component of the dynamic. And the reason we chose this dynamic here is because we know a lot more about this dynamic today than we know, say, of the biased-voter model. So that's the reason we picked this, but we could pick other dynamics too. Okay, but the key thing here now that defines a user, if you will, are their yi zeros, which are their innate values, and that's the value we want to get to as part of the sampling problem, the wisdom of the crowd problem, and the alpha parameter, which is the propensity to conform. Okay, and so let's go through the intuition first and how one can do this, right? But there's one obvious thing is to randomly choose k-sample. If you're sampling as to pick k nodes, you randomly pick k nodes in the network and take their innate value, their expressed values, and then average the value, right? Alternately, the ideal thing would be to do, because since I want the innate opinion itself, then the thing for me to go for are the stubborn nodes in the network, right? If I get all the stubborn nodes in the network, then I got my answer. But then, so what we call the conformity sampling, by proportional to the alpha, I would go pick the stubborn nodes in the network, some k nodes, right? But the problem with this again is that I'm not going to pick all the stubborn nodes. I'm only going to pick the k stubborn nodes, and since they are stubborn, they're not going to get the values of the other stubborn players or agents in the network. Okay. So there is a drawback with the conformity sampling also. So now we come to the third part, which is the influence sampling, where the goal now is to pick the conforming users, people who have low alphas, but who are surrounded by high alpha users, right? Stubborn agents around them or users around them, right? So what is this highly conforming user in the network doing? He or she is taking actually the average of all the stubborn neighbors around them or opinionated neighbors around the node, and then computing an average of that based on the dynamic itself and then giving you that answer. Okay? So, and these are the nodes that we like to present, and these are the nodes we like to pick, and that's exactly what the bias we introduce in the coin that is going to allow us to pick exactly these nodes. Okay? And what we show is that these kind of, so this indeed works on in a large scale setting. And again, we try to verify this using similar user studies where we ask the user initial questions, show some answers from the neighbors, and then we basically ask the user this to answer the question again, and we repeat this again to see if the user is actually converging, because this is actually a dynamic, right? And then here is actually to show you, this is exactly the survey that we did. We actually showed that when we set the dots experiment in the previous problem, this is exactly what we actually ran. So we asked the user the initial question in the left side, and the right side we showed some answers, and then asked the user again for the answer, right? And then, of course, what the slide is telling us is that we do actually, if you do influence sampling according to what our algorithm, we actually reduce the variance in the answer and as well as the error, the actual error itself. I think the y-axis there is the actual error itself. So, but we can normalize that and could have presented it in slightly different way. But we show that we can estimate it much better than the uniform random sampling or even conformity sampling. Okay, and then what we also did this, we ran this on some Twitter data as well as large-scale simulations, and we do observe a good improvement using the influence sampling. Okay, so this part I'll skip, but I just want to draw your attention, we can take this offline, is the key component here is, remember, we said we need to know the yi's of the sample nodes and all their alphas, and that might not be, people might ask, is that a reasonable assumption, that you need to know the alpha of every single user, right? And we actually did a sub-study here where we can actually estimate the alphas with reasonable accuracy for any user we want in the network, okay? And I'll take this, the questions regarding this offline. So finally, in the last part, we come to the role of the message, right? And this is different from influence maximization or opinion formation in the sense that now we take this question of persuasion. And persuasion is basically central to what should I say and how should I say it so that people believe what I'm saying is the right thing, right? So that they can adopt it or act on it and so on. Right, and this has been studied again extremely well. It's been very, very well studied for a long, long time in sociology and psychology literatures, and in fact, it goes back all the way to Socrates. But anyway, so here it's mostly a sender-centric problem. So the problem is, unlike the receiver side in the opinion dynamics, the sender here has to understand what is the right message to pick and convey so that people in the network adopt that message, right? And this is fundamentally different from just pure influence maximization again. So, sorry, it's Aristotle. And one of the well-studied things in psychology again is these three aspects of message, and of course there are more dimensions here, but we will focus on these three aspects of a message. Whether the message is logical, or it is emotional, or it's authoritative. Okay, it's coming from a person of authority that I can accept it, or it basically appeals to my emotional side of things, or is it extremely logical so that I believe what the user is saying. So in this, again, I'll start with the user study where we selected messages that fall into these buckets, right? So we basically handcrafted messages, we picked messages from online reviews, and we use the online users, again, as through a mechanical Turk study, to label these messages as either logical or emotional or both, okay? And then we also used a third dimension of sentiment. We asked the users in the experiment whether they have a positive or negative sentiment about a certain topic on that subject, right? And the thing we used were like on a particular car brand or a soda or some more general topic like organic food. Are you generally positively inclined towards organic food or negatively inclined and so on? And then we basically, what we did was on the receiver side, we asked them the initial sentiment, okay? And then, remember, once we got the messages labeled into these two, emotional and logical, we got 4 buckets now: emotional, not logical, not emotional, not logical, and so on. And then we basically, in the next experiment, based on the user's initial sentiment, we took messages of the opposite sentiment in one of the randomly chosen buckets and presented some messages to the user and saw how the sentiment of the user shifted, okay? You can actually see, for example, take organic food. Users who were negatively inclined initially actually made the largest jump once they saw a message of the positive sentiment from one of the buckets, okay? So they made the largest shift. They went more positive. But in the positive users who were positive initially did not change much. They did not take the negative sentiment even though they saw the messages of the opposite sentiment, okay? So this shows that basically the shift in sentiment is dependent on the topic as well as the initial sentiment the user has, okay? And coming to the sender side, we asked senders to say pick a message and assume that you are posting this message on Twitter or Facebook. What would the message be if you want to convince as many users as possible on this particular subject with your initial your sentiment, whatever, the negative or positive, okay? And here again, you'll see that the users pick different kind of, they have different masses. For example, in the case of organic food, they tend to largely pick both logical and emotional messages, whereas in the case of Coke, it's mostly logical, that they talk mostly about either completely logical or emotional, like I grew up with Coke during holidays all my childhood, and it somehow resonates with a lot of receivers, okay? So the choice of message is also very dependent on the topic. So it's not like people randomly pick messages to push them around through the network. And finally, I'll skip this part, but this basically shows that the users are actually different. It's not like everybody has the same preference vector, and they tend to they tend to be persuaded to a different extent based on the message. Based on the user. Even though it's the same message, different users get persuaded to a different extent. And here is a simple model. Then we come up with using these 3 observations from the experiment that a sender picks a model, a message. Let's call it a d-dimensional d-bit vector, and a node is a preference vector, right? And the node adopts the message if the preference vector and the sender's message vector are close to each other, okay? That's a model. It's a very simple model, right? And what did we do to actually verify this model? We depended on an earlier study. Actually, it's a very good paper by Sharad Goel and others from MSR NYC, where they studied structural virality or virality of information diffusion, okay? And they came up with this very interesting, and here is the data set that they worked on. Actually, it's a very large scale data set. And they came up with a measure of structural virality, which basically differentiates between broadcast diffusion and viral diffusion in these networks. A viral diffusion tend to basically go deep and take the form of a deep tree, whereas broadcast diffusions are very shallow trees with a large, basically fan out, okay? So, and what we show actually is, and what they have observed in their study, in this empirical data, over this data from Twitter, is that there's a lot of variance in the structural virality, right? Depending on the topic and who the sender is in the network, the depth of these trees actually varies very widely based on the topic and the sender, okay? But they tried to use some models like the SIR model to try to explain these variances, and they could not. And what we found that in using our simple model, we can actually explain their variances in their structural virality. And so that's a very interesting result. So here is one way we could actually tie the model we could come up with and take the model we came up with and tie it with a large-scale user study that's been done earlier. So to conclude, I think this area is for developing models in this area is extremely rich, right? Based on all the learnings we have from analyzing data at this scale, right? But again, I would say that we definitely need to go, and there's a big need for doing large-scale social experiments and go beyond the traditional sociology and psychology experiments where they did this very controlled experiments in rooms. We need to take this beyond that to do much more rigorous studies in models and then analysis. Okay. I'll stop now. Thank you.